Hey everybody, it's Fast Kareem with Learn It, and I want to present you a quick video on Excel Power User, using the newest version of Excel. As we all know, Office released the newest version of Office on October 5th, which comes with a whole new set of features for Word, Excel, and PowerPoint, and even Outlook. With that being said, if you're an Office 365 user, you will already have these features as well. And in this e-learning that we're going to take, I do have a set of topics that I want to cover. In Module 1, I want to focus on learning about a function that's somewhat new called XLOOKUP that's going to actually replace or alleviate a lot of the times that we need to use VLOOKUP or maybe index and match. And it's actually quite simple to fill out once we learn about the syntax, which we'll go over. And I want to go through various different examples of using the XLOOKUP. Maybe doing an approximate match or a two-way search, because we can do all those things using the XLOOKUP. It's pretty interesting. And I don't want to spend the entire time talking just about database functions. I want to focus on some text functions, like year, month, text, mid, how we can extract text, and even an introduction to the if function, so we can extract and figure out logical tests using cell values. Now, once we cover our functions, I want to spend some time in Module 1 learning about advanced pivot table techniques. This consists of maybe how to turn off get pivot data, how to build a new field within the pivot table report so that you can use it, or build a calculated item that gets held within a field. If that's not enough, we can also talk about grouping, whether it's a date, certain items within fields. And you can even adjust the settings of the pivot table to show percentages, currency values, by changing the show value as settings from the values box. Now this is just Module 1. There's actually a whole second module where we're going to focus on a special type of functions called array functions that allow values to be spilled into corresponding cells that surround the cell that you put the formula in. With that technique of array functions, I also want to show you a way of using index and match to look up multiple lookup values. Maybe you're looking for a shirt that has a certain price in a certain color, and all three of those items have to match for you to return your value. Now, once we cover the array functions and just go through a quick example of a few, I want to focus on some visuals, learning how to use conditional formatting with formulas, how to highlight an entire row based off a value, based off a certain logical test, or how to change alternate colors for each row. I also want to spend some time learning about advanced charting. We have a new recommended charts tool and quite a few new charts, one known as a combo chart as well, that allows you to put a line and a bar chart into one chart, hence the name combo. Module 2 is going to finish off with something pretty interesting known as macros, which is a small set of computer instructions that we write using VBA, Visual Basic for Applications. And we're actually not even going to write it, we're going to record ourselves doing actions, and we're going to save that. That way we can reuse that recording over and over again and essentially knock out those repetitive tasks that we have to do on our spreadsheets. I'm pretty excited, hopefully you are too. Let's get started with Excel Power User using Excel 2021. Now don't forget, I will occasionally ask you to pause the video. Practice these things. So don't be shy on practicing before moving on to that next topic that you want to learn about. That way we'll make sure that we've learned that topic before moving on to another one. All right. I've currently opened up the workbook that's available for you to download, and I'm actually on the very first worksheet called XLOOKUP Basics. With that being said, if you don't have the workbook open, be sure to pause the video and download the Excel file and open up the workbook and go to Excel Basics before beginning, because there will be a moment in time once I'm done describing this function where I just want you to practice filling it out yourself. So if you haven't downloaded it yet, pause the video and come right back. All right, so I'm actually looking at a list inside of a spreadsheet. Let me move this out of the way for a second. And this list is actually tracking the movies for 2021. The rating it got, the runtime, all of them are in 2021, so I can actually delete this column. I have the genre, the actual release date within the year, and the director's name. Now what I want to do is I want to build a lookup where I can actually type in some movie name, and in return it's going to give me the rating number, or maybe the runtime, or the genres, or the release date that I have, or maybe even the directors. Now, when we needed to do this in older versions of Excel, we had a function known as VLOOKUP. Now, the VLOOKUP function was useful, but there was a lot of rules that we had to remember. Like for every single argument that we had to fill out, the lookup value, the table array, column index number, and the range lookup, there was a little rule we had to follow. Like the lookup value had to be in the very first column of the data set. The table itself, or the list itself, had to have 2 or more columns. And in my case, I've actually satisfied that, so I don't need to worry too much. I have 1 column, I have 2 columns, 3 columns, and I deleted that year column. Remember that. So I have the 4th column here, 5th, and then 6th. So I have 6 columns. I'm doing pretty good. Now, in order to do a VLOOKUP, it's going to ask you to fill out those 4 arguments with the lookup value having to be in the first column of the data set. I'm going to use the title of every movie. And then it actually asks you to highlight the data set it wants you to search through. It has to be the whole thing. Regardless of how large it is, you have to highlight the whole thing. Starting from the lookup value, now, when I do grab this here, and I grab the table array, the next thing it's going to ask for is a column index number. It wants to know what value you want returned from which column. So if you want the rating returned for the Venom movie, you're going to choose column number 2. And that's actually putting a number in. You put the number of the column, but I, personally with VLOOKUP, like to just label the column numbers on top. That way I can just select them from there. And by default, the VLOOKUP will search for an approximate match. I'm going to change that last argument, the range lookup, to an exact match, which is set to false. So right here, this is going to look for my rating for Venom, which is 6.1. But if I do the same function and I actually just change one single argument, the column index number, everything stays the same, but when it comes time to get that 3rd argument, the column index number, this time I want to find the runtime. I can choose the 3rd column. And it returns the value that matches the Venom row from the 3rd column, which is actually the runtime. If I needed to maybe find out the genre, I can do that too. But I have to do each one of these one by one, as you can see, with the VLOOKUP here. Very similar function in nature for each one that I'm filling out. It's just that one argument has to be changed. And that's simply the column index number for that 3rd argument there. And of course, the range lookup always has to be set to exact match, otherwise it defaults to approximate. So I'm pulling this information. I'll do one more just for good keeping. I'll get the release date of this movie. But notice how each one has to be done separately. And my release date here, that's the final one I'm going to grab there. And I'll also do an exact match here. So I can have the runtime, genre, and I can have the release date And I'm just going to change this cell to actually be formatted as a date so that we can see the actual date that it was released. Now the VLOOKUP, very similar to the XLOOKUP that I'm going to introduce, but actually it's a lot easier to fill out. In fact, you only need to do it once. Let me explain. There's a new function that we have available, and it's actually known as the XLOOKUP function. Let me bring this to our attention here. Where instead of a VLOOKUP, we can now use an XLOOKUP, which has very similar arguments, a lookup value that can actually be anywhere inside the list. You also have something called a lookup array, which is now a single column that you specify that Excel can use to find your lookup value. So my lookup value will be inside of my lookup array. This is my lookup value, and this is my lookup array. Now the third actual required argument that it asks for is a return array. And that's the other columns that you would like returned. So you can highlight the list with these columns and it essentially will return the value that matches this row. So 6.1, 97, the genre, the release date, and even the director, if I have it highlighted. These other arguments are optional. I have error checking that I can use in case it doesn't find the actual value. It defaults to exact match. I don't have to worry about setting the match mode. And I can always search the list from the top or the bottom by changing the search mode settings. Let me do my first XLOOKUP by finding Venom as my lookup value. And for my lookup array, a single column that I can find a lookup value, I'm going to highlight the first column in the list. Now the cool thing about an array, the return array, is it can be more than one column. So if you want to return everything in one function, you can highlight the rest of the columns as the return array. And this will return that one single row of values that matches the Venom. And when I hit enter here, I can see that I've actually produced the same results, including the director name, with just one single formula. This is known as an array formula. We're going to learn about these in some more extent in a little bit. But as you can see, the values are spilling over to the surrounding cells. And in fact, these are all connected. Notice how the formula grays itself out if I were to try to edit the second cell. It's like, no, you have to edit it from here. These are all connected. It's a spill. So pretty interesting how we can easily use XLOOKUP to replace our VLOOKUP, and it does it in a much faster fashion. And the best part is our lookup value doesn't have to be the first column. I could have used a director to return a rating if there's a unique list of directors. Otherwise, it just returned the first occurrence of them. Now there is one other type of method, or I should say function, that we can use to deliver very similar results when you're wanting to return values from a list or a table. And before XLOOKUP was around, we would use another form of doing this, and this was known as nesting functions. We would use a combination of index, which simply, an index function, goes down an array. It's asking for an array, which is a single column. And it's typically the column that you're searching for. So if I'm searching for movie titles, I would have this selected. If I'm searching for ratings, I would have the rating column selected. And what I essentially would do here is I would match it. Instead of giving it an actual row number, I would match it to a lookup value. It's almost like a backwards VLOOKUP, to where I want it to match it to this lookup value that I can actually find inside of this list here. So it's going to essentially return the rating number for Venom. And I, of course, want to do an exact match here. an exact match. And I'm going to close my parentheses, both of them. And as you can see, I produced the same result of 6.1. But again, I have to do that one also, each and every one. If I wanted to look for my runtimes, I have to change the index to select the runtimes. So I'm indexing the runtimes this time because that's what I'm looking for. And then for the row number that the runtime can be found on, I don't know it. So I'm going to use the match function. Now with this match function, I can essentially choose a lookup value, the movie title as the lookup value, and where it can find the movie title in the first column of the list. And of course, I want to return an exact match of my lookup value. So I'm going to put 0 there. This is going to return the runtime. And same thing with genre. If you're looking for a genre that you wanted to match it to, right, you're going to index the genres. There might be some blanks in the genres. As you can see, notice there are some blanks. And then I can match it to the lookup value here that I can find inside of this list. And of course, 0 means exact match. And I can pull out the genres there. Here, I'll do one more for good keeping. Maybe I want to return the release date. The release date, so that means I have to index all the dates. This essentially makes the dates searchable. These are all the movie dates that I have released. And for the row number here, match, I'm going to do a lookup value. I want to look up with this movie title so that I can find the release date of it here. And they're just going to change this to a date so that you can see that the release date is the same. So I've been talking for a little while, and I've done actually 3 different functions here. The first one was the traditional VLOOKUP that we should know, and if we don't, that's a nice little refresher on it. But don't worry too much, because you can actually do a lot of what I showed you using XLOOKUP, and it spills the results. And then of course, if both of those fail for you, if you just prefer to fill out the index and match, the index and match, which is a nested function, will always be available. Here, I'm going to go to my data tab, or better yet, my formulas tab, and turn on show formulas, just so you can take a peek at these formulas without having to constantly go back to the video. And I want you to practice. I want you to practice filling out a VLOOKUP, a XLOOKUP, and an index and match with the formulas on the screen. Pause the video here before we move on and learn about a few other examples that I have for XLOOKUP. And then we'll start talking about those text functions that we want to talk about in Module 1. All right, welcome back. I'm actually on the second worksheet of the workbook called XLOOKUP _ two-way. And I'm looking at a very simple list of information where we have column values and we also have row values that we're looking for. I'm looking for a certain material type, and in our case it's going to be wood, but I want to find a specific price from group B. So I'm actually looking for this value here, 76.23. And if I want, an XLOOKUP can do a two-way search. Your return array can be another XLOOKUP. I can use the lookup value. Let's find the wood column first, or the wood row value first. And I'm going to use the lookup array with a list of materials. And because I don't know what to return yet, because I have to look through the columns, I'm going to do another XLOOKUP that returns column B's values from this list here. And whatever it returns, I want it to find in this array that I have. So it's going to look through this list and eventually pinpoint it to 76.23. I'm going to close out both of my parentheses here. If I were to hit enter, I'm going to find the 76.23. Something really cool I want you to know is if you get this formula, and you add it over here to the name box, I'm just going to paste the formula into the name box there and hit enter. Excel will actually highlight the value from within the list. Isn't that cool? So if I get this formula that made this value and pinpoint it and paste it inside of the name box, and I hit enter, it will end up showing me the value from the list, so I can actually pinpoint it and find out, oh, it's on row 6 in column C. Same for any other one I've shown. I could have done this for any other one. If I were to get this XLOOKUP here that spills, and I control copy it and I paste it inside of my name box, the actual formula, not the actual answer, but the formula. It's going to automatically highlight that row. Isn't that cool? I don't know. It's worth a mention. Might help you out one day. But before moving on, if you haven't tried the basics yet, feel free to try that. But I do want you to try doing an XLOOKUP with a two-way search. And just to cover all bases, try getting this formula, pasting it into your name box, and seeing if it will go ahead and move your cell address box to the correct value. Practice that. That's enough for XLOOKUP here, and VLOOKUP and index and match. Coming up next, we're going to go to the third worksheet of the workbook and learn a little bit about text functions that we have available in Excel and how we can benefit from them. I am currently in the workbook on a worksheet known as text. It's the third worksheet in the workbook. And I'm looking at the Books and Beyond Incorporated employee list here, where we're tracking the hourly rate, the gross pay, how many hours they've worked. But before I build my report, I actually have to add some more values to track my employees with. I want to figure out whether or not employees are part-time or full-time. I want to do a year-by-year analysis to see how many people I'm hiring per year, and as well as a month-per-year analysis, see how many people I'm hiring every month within every year. I can actually extract these values using sets of functions, like one being the if. It just checks whether a condition, whether something is true or false. And depending on if it's true, like if this hourly rate is over 40, it might say full-time. And depending on if it's false, it might say part-time. So I'm simply going to select a logical test here that will compare the hours worked if it's greater than or equal to 40. If it so happens to be, I want it to actually say full-time. If you are unfamiliar with text in Excel, they call them strings. It has to be put in quotes, an open quote and an end quote for every argument that has a string, which means words. And if it's part-time, I'm going to put it in its own set of quotes, PT for part-time, and an open and close quote. And I'm going to close my parenthesis. And if I were to hit Control-Enter, it will put the answer in. And if I would like, I can actually use my autofill handle, that little tiny square, and do 2 clicks to drag down. That's just one function. Another one I can use to extract the year from every hire date is a formula or a function called year. All it needs is a serial number, which is a cell that's formatted as a date. So these cells here in Excel, if I go to the Home tab, they're formatted as dates. So it knows that these are serial numbers. And if I were to grab one of these serial numbers for myself and close the parenthesis, and if I hit Control-Enter, it'll put the answer in without going down to the second cell, and I can double-click my autofill handle. I can even put them together. There's also a month function where I can grab just the month from the serial number, and then if I add an ampersand, and in quotes I put a dash and another ampersand, I can also conjoin the year and concatenate it. So this is going to give me the month and a dash. Let me put a space in between that dash. The year. Control Enter 12/2001. In fact, I don't like that space. Looks too spaced out. Let me fix that. There we go. And I'm just going to go ahead and go autofill all the way down. So I've done 3 different text functions. One uses a logical test, and it spits out full-time or part-time. Another one grabs the year from the date, and another one gets the month and year and concatenates it together. I recommend that you give this a try before moving on, and we're going to start learning about pivot tables, some advanced pivot table techniques. Let me go to my Formulas tab and hit Show Formulas here, because I just want to give you a chance to see these formulas before you actually have to fill them out. Let me make the screen a little bit bigger here. In addition to this, everybody, there's one function that I did in the very beginning of the video, and I just want to point it out. If you want to put the current date, like today's date, in a cell, you can hit Control plus a semicolon. Whatever cell you're on will have today's date within the cell. So keep that in mind if you ever need to add the current date, like maybe the payroll for the period ending. You wanted to quickly add the current date. Very easy to do so. Go ahead and practice this. I will leave the formulas on the screen for you to give it a quick little pause. And we'll move on to some advanced pivot table techniques to wrap up Module 1. I'm over here on the 4th worksheet in the workbook called Complete Data, where it's tracking the order details for December of 2014. And this is actually 26 different columns of data. 26 where we're tracking various salespeople, what region they come from, what products they're selling, what categories they're selling, and how much units they've sold, and how much revenue each one has brought in. So if someone were to ask you, hey, Faz, that's me, who's the top seller for the year? And who's the bottom seller? For bonus purposes. What we can do, essentially, is create something known as a pivot table. Now, what I'm looking at here inside of this data set is called a table. That's why it has the blue and white colored rows. In fact, I went into my list and I inserted the table. That's why it's grayed out. It's already inserted. This table gives me a set of tools like naming the data set, the ability to remove duplicates from the data set, and even change the color of the formatting. We talk a lot about tables in our Excel Advanced course. With that being said, we can also summarize this data with pivot tables. I'm going to build a pivot table to track that, the top seller and the bottom seller, using the salespeople names. I'm going to summarize this with the pivot table on a new worksheet. So when I click on that, it's going to let me build a pivot table on a new worksheet using the 2014 sales data from the table. I'm just going to hit OK. And I'm going to call this one pivot table. I'm going to rename the worksheet pivot table by double clicking into it. Pivot table. There, I'll call it worksheet. There. And if I zoom into the spreadsheet, it's actually telling me something. It's saying click in this area to work with the pivot table report. I'm sure many of us have been playing around with pivot tables before. We're in the Power User course, but if you don't know, as soon as you click in here, Excel will give you access to the Analyze tab, the Design tab, and your pivot table field list. And as soon as you go away from this area, it thinks you no longer want to build the report, and it hides all those things from you. No fun. But again, click in this area to work with those areas. One thing that I personally do when building my report, since 2016 now, is I go to this toolbox and I change the fields. The column names are called fields, and I put them in alphabetical order in this list. I want it easier to browse through. I can do that by changing the sort order. In addition to that, I reorganize this area to put it side by side. That way I can see all of my fields without having to use a scroll bar. and I still have access to all 4 of my boxes to create my report. I'm just building a basic report where I'm tracking the salesperson, and I want to see the revenue that each one has brought in for me. And since it is revenue, I'm just going to change the value field to show currency, show values as, and change the number format here to show currency with no decimal places. So that should all be very basic. And if it's not, I definitely take a peek at our Excel Advanced video where we cover building pivot tables from the ground up. But this looks good. I have my pivot table. I have an area where I can filter each salesperson. I have the revenue that each one has. Now there's something I want to show you though. Inside the Pivot Table Analyze tab, there's a small little drop down in the very first command group called Options. And one of the options are to generate Get Pivot Data. And what this essentially allows you to do is, well, not allow you to do, is it ends up getting the actual formula that it used to figure out this answer. So if I needed to multiply this by like 5% to give out a bonus or to do a calculation and do a projection of some sort, I would have to deal with this one by one because each formula will return the Get Pivot Data. I can actually turn that off to make it much more human readable if I need to. Inside the pivot table, under the options here, I can check mark and I can turn it off. I can generate Get Pivot Table, and then it's just going to treat every cell from the pivot table like a normal cell address. Which is great because I sometimes need to, use these for calculations. But there are situations with my pivot table to where the field, the item that I want to display, doesn't even exist inside of the data. I actually want to give out a bonus of 5% to each of my salespeople. And I want to see how much each salesperson got as a bonus, depending on their sales. So what I can do here is, instead of doing it by hand, I have this tool inside of my calculations command group of the Pivot Table Analyze tab. And it allows me to build a new field, one of these, using an existing field within the formula. So let me build a new field by going into the sum of revenue and going into my Pivot Table Analyze tab and building a calculated field. I'm going to go ahead and call this one bonus. And for the formula, on the bottom here, I'm simply going to grab the revenue way down there. And I'm going to multiply it with 5%. When I hit add here, it's going to create a new field called bonus that will show up in my pivot table report that I can use from that point forward. So that's known as a calculated field. It shows up in our field list. There are also ways where you can get the actual items within a field. So if my field is salesperson, the items within the salesperson is Andrew, Ann, Jan, Laura. What I want to actually show you is I can get some of these items and add them together. Maybe Andrew and Ann are part of one team. And in the organization, we see them as one sales team. So what we can do is, if we go into the actual items, if I click on one item, the important part is clicking on the item first. I can build a calculated item by adding Andrew and Ann's revenue together and naming it something. I'm going to call this one Team 1. Andrew and Ann is Team 1. And I'm simply going to build a formula where I get Andrew and I add to Ann sales. And when I hit add here, it will build me a new item called Team 1. Very important to remember to turn off and hide the sales, because otherwise it doubles up for Andrew and Ann and team 1. So I'm just going to filter off Andrew and Ann's sales. And we're back to their original values we had. I can keep doing that. I can build Jan and Laura into a team as well. I'm going to call this one team 2. And I said it was going to be Jan, insert item, plus Laura here. And if I hit OK, there's my team 2, and I can filter off those other 2 options. If I wanted to build, let's just complete the list. Let's put them into teams, teams of 2. Team 3, I can go ahead and build a formula with the next 2 users. And this time it's going to be Mariah. And I'm going to do Nancy. Ooh, Michael, actually. Apologies. Hit OK. There's my team 3. And I can filter off those 2 results. And I have one more team 4 with Nancy and Robert that I have to create a calculated item. I'm just going to insert Nancy's sales and add them to Robert's sales. Hit OK, and then I'm going to filter off those results. This is great. It groups them together. It works very well. But another method that I see some users do, instead of actually building a calculated item that adds them, is they group the names into a header. And that header can then be expanded and collapsed. So they can actually dig deeper and see what team and what salespeople are a part of each team. Let me show you that. This other method of essentially grouping. I'm going to first delete all of these items that I built. It's the same area that you go to create them. Except this time I'm just going to go to team 1, hit delete. Go to team 2 or team 3, 2, and just delete them one by one. Now I can go ahead and show all the items from my filter again. Now instead, if I highlight these 2 items and I right click, the option to group becomes available. And I can rename group 1. I'm just going to call this one team 1. I can also do the same thing for Jan and Laura here. I'll go ahead and call that one team 2. Notice how I'm renaming them from the formula bar. I'll do Michael and Mariah here for team 3. And I'll do Nancy and Robert for team 4. Now I have these new teams. Oh, I may have missed one. Looks like I did. I missed a few people in the team. Let me go ahead and redo that one. Group. There we go. Team 4. And let me add Michael to team 3 as well. Group. And I'm going to call that one team 3. And I'm going to add Laura to team 2 there by right-clicking and grouping, calling that team 2. Cool. There we go. That looks much cleaner. Now notice the difference between the 2. This one I can expand and collapse, where the other one I couldn't, because these are groupings that I've built. And in fact, sometimes I'll even go to my pivot table analyze tab and I'll turn off the buttons that expand and collapse the report, making it fixed. Whether I want just a certain group available or all of them expanded, I can choose to do that. Maybe I only want team 1 expanded because that's the team I focus on, and everything else collapsed. And I can hide the buttons up top. Pretty interesting. I can even group dates. If I do like an order date, if I throw that into a certain value, like the columns, it automatically will group it into months. I can throw out the months and go into dates if I need to. So these are automatic groupings too that happen. If I just throw in a date field, as long as it's formatted as a date, it'll group them into months and quarters, or just so you can see the whole date as soon as you throw it in there. So there was a few things that I practiced here, just to pinpoint them before I pause the video. We definitely practiced turning off get pivot data. That was the first thing we did. And then from there, we also learned about building a field and an item. Don't forget about the groupings. We also right-click and did a group. And a small thing, but we also changed the number format of the sum of revenue to $ and hid the decimal places by changing the number format of the values box. So pause the video, try to build this pivot table report, but focusing on get pivot data, calculated items and fields, grouping, and showing the values as, changing the number formats. I can even change the sum of revenue if I needed to, value field settings, to percentages, percentage of grand total. Hit OK. That's also something I could have done. Let me undo that though. I'm just going to hit Control Z. Give this a go. Come back when you're ready, and we'll start talking about Module 2. So a little bit more on array functions. We learned that our XLOOKUP can spill values of an array, and we can find multiple items in one search. But what if we're actually using multiple criterias to search through and find a price? Like, for example, in this case, we're looking for an item that's a t-shirt, but it's also large. So these three or these four will work. But again, the large ones, so these ones are all canceled out. This one's canceled out. This one's might work. This one's extra large, so it's canceled out. And we want the color red. So that means all these ones get canceled out. It can only be one possible option, as you can see. Let's see how I found that out using a function, the index and match. Remember, when we went over the basics, we index what we're looking for. So if I'm looking for a price, I'm going to go ahead and index the price column. And we end up matching it to a lookup value. But when you match it to more than one value that you're searching for, you're always going to use the lookup value as the number 1, which means true. What you're essentially going to do now for the lookup array is you're going to do 3 searches. I'm first going to look for the t-shirt. I'm going to put it in parentheses so you can see it. Inside of this column here. So it's going to find a match. It's going to find actually 4 matches there. I'm going to multiply that. I know this seems weird, but I'm going to multiply it with another search. I'm going to put it in all parentheses just so we can see them. The medium from the size column. I'm going to close that parenthesis and multiply it with the color blue from the color column. And I want to find an exact match. And I'm just going to close out my parentheses here. So essentially, this is going down every single column. The item, size, and color. And when it finds a match for the item you're looking for, whether it's t-shirt, medium, or blue, that cell value is going to have the number 1 in the back end. It's going to mean true, that it matched. So right here, what's going to happen is you're going to have the number 1, the number 1, the number 1. This is going to be the number 0, the number 0, the number 0, because that's false. They're not t-shirts. And it's going to go back to the number 1. Now it's going to do the same thing for size. It's going to look for everything medium. So everything medium is only going to be 1. Everything else is 0. And it's going to go down and do the same thing for color. So it's going to find everywhere it says blue, and it's going to put the number 1. And now remember, we multiplied each one of these. This little asterisk means multiply. So we multiplied these. These are all equations. Only one of these rows are going to return the number 1. If you think about it, we're looking for the number 1. Our lookup value is the number 1. And only one of these rows will actually return my value. 1 times 1 times 1 will be 1. Everything else is actually 0. It's all going to return a 0. These are not matches. Pretty cool, right? In older versions of Excel, you actually have to hit Control-Shift-Enter to put the formula in. Now you can go ahead and hit Enter here. I'll do one more. I'll probably do 2 more, actually. Why not? So we index what we're looking for. That's our price. And then we match it to the number 1. And then that's when we start doing our search criteria for our hoodie this time, which you can find in the item column. Multiplied to our size, which you can find in the size column. Multiplied to our color. That would fit me perfectly. And I'm just going to close out my parentheses looking for an exact match. So this time there's only one row that will pull up a hoodie that's large, that's black. That's $30, the pricey one. Here, I'll do this final one too, then I'll give you a chance to practice, but I'm going to index what I'm looking for, which is the price. I'm going to hit comma, and I'm going to use the match function and match it to the number 1, which means true. And that's when my search criteria for my lookup value happens for each column. I'm going to look for a hoodie inside of the item, multiply it, look for the medium size inside of the size, close the parenthesis and multiply it, look at the color inside of the color, and then close that final parenthesis and then hit. Of course, you have to have your lookup match type, which is exact match. Then you're going to close out both parentheses, which a hoodie that's medium in blue is $29. Go ahead and practice these. Here, I'll go to my formulas tab and hit show formulas. It's a pretty interesting one, I know. It's pretty cool, pretty robust if you ask me, but it uses Boolean logic where we have the values true and false helping us determine those answers. Here's the formulas for all 4. Let me zoom out just a bit. Here we go. Go ahead and pause the video here and practice this before we move on to some advanced conditional formatting examples that I put together. Just 3. So I'm over here on the worksheet called Hide Errors. And I want to show everyone how we can use formulas to build pretty advanced conditional formats. Like over here in the daily column, I have a division by error message. And I would like to actually highlight this column and hide those error codes. I can use a formula called isError, and if that condition ends up being true, I can change the font to white, which will hide that in the cell. isError just looks for any cell that has an error code in it, which mine does. Let me build a new rule by going to the Home tab and setting a conditional format with a new rule that allows me to use a formula to determine which cells to format. And then from here, I can type in isError, and I can type in C2 to go down the column. I'm going to format the cells with a color of white, for the font specifically. When I hit OK here, I can see that the rule has been applied. Not to be alarmed though, I can always look into the formula bar to see the formula that caused the error. In addition to that, if I ever need to edit the rule or delete the rule, I can always go to New Rule or to Manage Rules. Instead of creating it, I can go ahead and delete the rule there, like so. So whether it's adding it or deleting it, you're both going to go to the Home tab in the same area, whether it's New Rule or Manage Rules. and we're going to put a formula into that cell there with the column highlighted. I'm going to format the cells and hit OK. I have another version, another example, where it's going to hide the duplicate values in a list. Let me hit Control and page down to go to hide duplicate values. So with this regions here, I just want to hide the duplicate region, kind of like how a pivot table would display values. And as long as the table's sorted, I can highlight this to hide any duplicate from above. So if A1 is equal to A2, if A1 is equal to A2, I want to hide it. So on and so forth for each and every value. I'm going to build a new rule, and I'm going to use a formula. If it's equal to A2, which is equal to A1, I want to format that, again, to white font. Don't worry, the words are still there. If I change the cell shading, we can still see the words are there. It just has white font. I have one more example. I'm going to hit Control page down here to show this example. And this is where we're looking at a list of dates, units, costs, and the total. I want to actually highlight an entire row where the values are greater than 75 for the units. So if I highlight this data chunk and I build a new rule, I can use a formula and I can take advantage of absolute referencing to lock in column B, but it can go down the rows and it can check if it's greater than 75. Not greater than or equal to, but just greater than 75. And if it is, I want to format the fill of that row with blue, and I'm going to hit OK. So now if I change this value to maybe 80, we're going to see that it automatically highlights it as well. So we've gone over 3 different conditional formatting. All 3 required a formula. The format entire row, I'm going to hit Control page up, hide duplicate values, and as well as hide errors. I'm going to hit Control page up one more time. Practice these 3 formulas, or these 3 conditional formats that require formulas. I've left the formula in a text box for each one of these sheets before we move on to learn about the new recommended charts tool, quick analysis, and spark lines. Not too much left. We have charts and then a very interesting topic called macros. Go ahead and pause the video, practice these conditional formats, and come right back. All right. I'm actually over here on the second to last worksheet called Charting 1, looking at the sales figure for a particular year, just a month in January. And I'm going to highlight this data by simply going into the data set and using the keyboard shortcut Control and the letter A. Because that just grabs all of the data. And if you're on a PC, we now have this little item that pops up called Quick Analysis that allows us to browse our charts, insert totals, create conditional formatting, add tables, and even spark lines. So if I'm missing a column, like maybe my average, I can easily use Quick Analysis to go to totals and either build a row for the average, or if I browse through this list, keep browsing, there's also a little arrow here where I can choose an average column. When I click on that, it's going to add the averages for all of the rows that I had selected, and I can reselect Control A to include that as part of the data of my chart. When I go over to the charts area in Quick Analysis, it will show me a list of charts that it might recommend based off the data that I have laid out. And this is looking like a combo chart where the average itself is a line going across the bars. Or I can just use a typical bar chart. I have different variations. Here's a stacked one, and here's a horizontal one. If these aren't cutting it, we even have a tool called Recommended Charts. I can also have done this all from the Insert tab. I just like showing the most modern way of doing things. Now, when I click on this, it's going to show me a list of charts that it would like to recommend based off the data. I don't have to listen to it. I can always click on all charts and pick from my templates that I've created or any other chart type that Excel has to offer. But that combo chart looks pretty good for my situation, that combo chart. Let me build it myself though. I'm just going to change each salesperson to be a column, like so there. Column, column. And I'm going to get my average. And I can change that to a line if I need to. I can also just very well pick the recommended chart here. Here, let me show you something. I'm going to go back to all charts and hit OK here. And I'm going to get the salespeople names from the chart, and I'm going to switch them with the weeks and the averages. So my legend can show week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4. I can do that by selecting a chart, and under chart design, I can switch the rows and columns. Now, if I go back and I change this chart to a combo chart, I can select the average to be a line. Let me go over to change chart type. Remember, the chart design tab is only there when you have the chart selected. And the change chart type, I'm going to instantly go down to combo this time. And now I can see that the legend is showing the weeks. And I can change, not week 4, but the average to a line. I can hit OK. So that's just one type of pretty advanced chart. It's known as a combo chart, but it's not too hard to make. In fact, a lot of chart editing has become simple if I need to delete things from my chart. I can add and remove the elements directly from the chart handle, the plus sign. I can get rid of my grid lines. It looks a lot cleaner without them. I can get the legend and move it somewhere where it's more noticeable, maybe to the top. If the data is small enough, I can add data tables to the bottom of the chart as well. But that looks like a lot of data to browse through, so I'm just going to hide it. I can also format this chart. Everybody. I can change the style with any built-in styles that I have available. Or even change the color scheme. Let's do green for Excel. I also have the ability to filter. I can filter this chart to hide certain items from it. There, I hid my average there. I'm going to reapply it. Now, something really cool with PowerPoint and Excel is that they work together. If you want to present with this chart in a presentation, and you want these values to change and have the chart update in the presentation, you can always copy the chart from Excel. And if you go into PowerPoint, this is our PowerPoint here. And if you just insert a new slide, I'll insert a slide just to demonstrate this. This is very useful, I've noticed. I can actually choose a chart and I can just simply paste and link the data. There's an option to paste and link the data. When I do this, if I change one of the values, if I change one of these values maybe to 2000, see how my chart changes itself in the presentation? Of course, it has to be on the same machine. I'll change that to 1000. That's more dramatic. I saw that bar change. I changed the average. Well, that's a formula. I can't change that. Let me change this to 300. See a dramatic change there in the chart. So again, even if we need to put the presentation in PowerPoint, that data can be connected and linked. Pretty robust example. I wasn't planning to go there, but I just thought on top of my head, hey, that might be useful to see. This connection between the two. Let me go back into Excel here, which is our main focus. This chart looks good. It looks clean. It's a little transparent, but it's okay. I can easily change that by changing the style that I chose. What I want you to do now, I spent about a few minutes talking about charts, inserting them, adding in the average column. Practice doing it yourself. Seeing if you can insert a chart, change it to a combo chart, switch the row and column, and also, just as an example, try seeing if you can link it to a PowerPoint. And if you do have to do that in your job role or if you feel like you're going to do that in the near future, very powerful tool to connect the PowerPoint and the Excel workbook together. Don't forget to come back though. I have one more topic, which is macros, how to create, save, and run a macro, which will save a lot of time for these repetitive tasks that we have to do in a spreadsheet. So a macro is a small set of computer instructions. In Excel, Word, and PowerPoint, we don't actually write the code. We record ourselves doing certain tasks, and the code gets written out for us. From there, we can save the code and reuse it as a button on the spreadsheet or a button within the ribbon, depending on where you've saved the macro. Let me explain. I'm going to build a very basic macro. For this example, you probably don't have to do it. I'm not going to have you pause the video and do it. You're going to do the other one that's more robust, but it will just give you an idea of what a macro is going to do before actually diving into it. I want to build a macro that will automatically add, once I record it, my first and last name, my company name, and the date to 3 cells in a spreadsheet. Doesn't matter what 3 cells they are. Now, in order to record a macro, I have to have the developer tab turned on. You may not have it on right now, don't worry. It can easily be turned on. You might have to go to your File tab just once, and under the bottom here where it says Options, right at the bottom, Options, I can choose to customize my ribbon, and I can turn on my developer tab. And that's actually what I did. If I had it off, it wouldn't be there. See, it goes away. But if I go back to File, Options, Customize ribbon, I can turn on my developer tab and hit OK. And it comes right back. This is actually where we go to record our macro and change the style of macro we're recording. So let me build a very simple macro. There's 2 types of ways I can record it. The first one is called absolute referencing. By default, absolute referencing is turned on, meaning when you record your macro and you type something in cell A1, the macro will always place that value in the cell A1. Even if you were to be here and you play your macro, it's going to run the macro and it's going to add the value, in our case, my first and last name, to cell A1. But if I take a step and I turn on something known as relative referencing, this is going to change the code that it creates to allow me to add the macro on any cell. So even though I typed the macro on cell A1, if I hit run macro on cell D5, my name will show up here, which is most likely the way you want to record your macros. You want more flexibility. So let me record my first macro. I'm going to call it my first macro. It has to be one word. I'm going to add the shift key and the letter F to my shortcut, shift F. I just hit shift F and it adds the shift key to the shortcut. There are not too many shortcuts that hold the shift key. And I'm going to save this macro inside the actual workbook that I have, which I will have to go and save the Excel workbook as a .xlsm workbook that has a macro enabled. That way I can email it to others and the macro is saved. But if I wanted to use this macro in any other workbook, I would save it in my personal macro workbook. This is a hidden workbook that's in Excel in the application folders that will always be available to you without you actually seeing the workbook. And this will allow you to run your macros across all of your workbooks. But since this is just a demo, all of these macros in this training are a demo, I'm saving it to this workbook. And I'm just going to call it my first macro. And when I hit OK here, the first thing I'm going to do is go to cell A1. If you're not already on it, go to cell A1. And everything I do is being recorded. So fast Kareem's being recorded. I put equal today, open and close parenthesis. That will always give me the current date. And then I'll go ahead and type in learn it. And I'm just for good keeping, at the end, I'm going to click back on cell A1. All that was recorded. And if I hit stop recording, I have now saved my recording for myself. And if I want, here, let me delete this. I can hit Control-Shift-F, and it'll add those values to those cells. Or I can go to any cell, Control-Shift-F, and it'll add those values to those cells because I've recorded myself doing it. I can also select here and go over to my macro library, and I can run my macro. That's in case I ever forget the shortcut. In addition to that, some people like going over here where it says Insert, and they add something called a form control, where they can paste and draw a button on the screen, and they can assign their macro to it. And now I can actually, here, let me click away from it, and now I can actually click this button to create my macro and essentially run my macro on the spreadsheet, making it very easy and user-friendly to use. I can actually rename the button too, but the right click. So what if I wanted to capitalize my last name? I can always go to my macro library, and instead I can choose to edit, not run, but edit. This is a VB editor. You don't need to know the VB code inside of it, but there is code here. It's a subroutine, a subprocess called my first macro. These green lines are just comments. Apostrophe makes it a comment. And these are the lines of code. It uses an object called ActiveCell with a method called select. And it goes into that cell, it selects it. It uses a formula, a method called formula R1C1 to type in my name. From here, I can change it and capitalize my name. I don't need to know too much VBA to make edits like that. And then I hit enter and I put today in. I hit enter again. These are all my enters, the offsets. It goes down one cell, and at the very end, I go back up 2 cells. So I made a change. I'm just going to hit save here. And look at what it's saying. To save the file with these features, click no, and it says click no, and then choose a macro-enabled file type in the file type list. To continue saving as a macro-free, oh no, we want to save this, click yes. I'm going to hit no, because I need to save the macro too. It's in the workbook. And all I have to make sure to do is to save this file as a macro-enabled workbook. This way, if I email the file to someone, the macro will also come equipped with it. Otherwise, it will not. You will lose the macro the second you close the workbook, if you forget to save it as a macro-enabled workbook. Huge step. Let me hit save here. All right, and if I close this little editor window and I run my header again, we're going to see that the K is capitalized this time. So this was just a sample, a demo of what a macro does, giving you an idea of relative referencing, giving you idea of hitting the record button, me running my macro, me editing my macro, giving you a snippet of how the code looks. That's all I wanted to do. If you want to practice this, that's fine. Feel free to. But I'm going to show you an actual example coming up next where I'm going to format something I pull from my database every month. And I just wanted to have some color. I wanted to have my initials, the date. I want all these things to be filled out with the click of a button since I have to do this every month or maybe every week. Feel free to practice the very basic macro if you need to, but go ahead and pause the video if you need to do that. If not, we're going to go ahead and continue on and practice filling out and formatting this data set, and then seeing if it works on other data sets that I get across the month. I'm currently on the data for recording worksheet, and I'm looking at a data set that I pull every month. Some months it ends up coming up much larger than the previous month in terms of data. And it's my job to actually format this and make it presentable before I send it out to my team. And I just want to save some time by recording myself formatting it just once, and that way I can just assign this to a button or a keyboard shortcut, and I can run my macro on the other data sets that I get across the coming months. Let me go to my developer tab here, and if you don't have one, be sure to watch the macro basics video right before this that explains how to add the developer tab, and it runs through a very basic macro. If you've already seen that, I'm going to go ahead and continue. And I'm simply going to hit record macro here, and I'm going to call this macro my format macro. It has to be one word in the name. I'm going to call it with the shortcut Control-Shift-M for macro. As long as I hold the Shift key and then a letter, it will actually add the Shift key to my shortcut, making it extremely useful. There's not too many shortcuts that have Shift. A macro to format my data. I'm going to make sure to save this macro in this workbook because this is already an XLSM workbook. We've saved it as that in our previous example so that our macros can be stored and saved upon emailing. When I hit OK here, it's going to instantly start recording my macro, and I'm going to go to the Excel Home tab and choose my styles that I would like. So I'm going to pick my Home tab here, and under Styles, I'm going to pick my first one to be a title, and I'm going to hit Enter, and for monthly phone sales, I'm going to pick that one, and I'm going to have that be a heading 4. And I'm going to keep hitting Enter going down. I'm going to hit Tab. Tab goes to the right. And for my run date, I'm going to put equal today so that the current date will always be spit out. My ran by, I'm going to put FK, my initials, just hitting Enter and tabbing my way there. And when I hit Enter and Enter again, I can use the Control, Shift, and the right arrow to highlight all of the columns going to the right. And I can use Control, Shift, down arrow to highlight all the columns going down. It's extremely important to do it this way. Otherwise, your data set that has larger columns or larger amount of rows won't actually format itself if you don't use these shortcuts and you just use your mouse. It won't know how to actually grab that extra data next month. I'm just going to change this over to a very simple input cell because that's what these are, inputs. And I'm just going to go back now that I'm done to cell A1 and go to my developer tab and hit stop recording. I can end up practicing my macro and I can run it by using Control-Shift-M, my shortcut. It works pretty fine on the same exact size of data, right? It works perfectly fine. I can also go to this sheet called More Data, and as long as I'm lined up on cell A1, I'm going to go to Macros and hit My Format macro and hit Run. And I can see that it runs even on a larger data set. My final run here, let me just add in an additional column to see if it works. If I go to record macro, my first macro, run. I can see even with additional columns. So I do want you to practice this before concluding the course. Just practice running a macro and seeing if it works on these larger data sets. I don't want you to worry too much if your macro gives you an error. The best thing you can do is to start over. To delete that macro, just go to the macros library and select it and delete it and just start over with a new macro and reapply those steps. Maybe watch the video again. The big key thing is to use your shortcuts. Use the Enter key. Use the Tab key. Use the Control, the Shift, the right arrow. Practice this. When you come back, we'll talk about what we've learned and conclude the course. All right, give yourself a pat on the back. Congratulations. You've completed Excel Power User, focusing on Excel 2021, the newest features that we have available. My name is Fast Kareem, and this course was provided through LearnIt. In these two modules, we learned about the XLOOKUP, text functions, advanced pivot table techniques, and a little bit about arrays, conditional formatting, charting, and we finished off with macros. Until next time, stay happy, healthy, and well, everyone. Take care.